to Long Shorts. I'm Emily Baum, and today I'm here with Gina Tam, an assistant professor of history at Trinity University and author of the book Dialect and Nationalism in China, 1860 to 1960. Gina, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to chat with you.
So Gina, when we think about China today, we tend to think that there are one or maybe two main languages, Mandarin and Cantonese, and then a bunch of local or regional dialects. So how does your book challenge those assumptions?
So that's a great question. And you're absolutely right that that is generally how we frame Chinese linguistic diversity. And as I was researching this book, I found that this is a really sort of controversial construct. And in particular, there are a lot of scholars who challenge this on the basis of these are just the wrong terms for the wrong phenomenon, right? They'll say essentially that dialects are mutually intelligible with one another and Shanghainese and Fujianese are not, and therefore they're not dialects. And so they're sort of moving the goalposts. Me, however, I challenge this in a different way, in that I sort of am interested in how and why we started to even frame these linguistic phenomenon as languages and dialects, and what that tells us about Chinese nation building. So I'm really sort of interested in the historical constructedness of this. My book is called Dialect and Nationalism in China because you have to have an English title for your English language book, right? But really what my book is a history of the term fangyan, which if we sort of break it down, like fang means place and yan means language, but we almost always translate that term normally as dialect. But the term fangyan historically, which has been around, there are books called fangyan that go back millennia, that don't necessarily have the same connotations as the English term dialect does. Mutual intelligibility is one example of that. The other is that we tend to think of dialects as being subsidiary, right? Like dialects are dialects of something, right? Dialects of Chinese, dialects of Italian, or whatever. And fangyan didn't have that connotation that they are subsidiary of something, right? And so my book traces how these two terms, dialect and fangyan, get translated into one another, and the implications of pairing those two terms together, what that has on imagining what the Chinese nation is. The second sort of briefly history that this gets into is the presumption that there has to be a Chinese language in the first place. So at sort of the middle or the end of the 19th century, you have Western sojourners and colonists coming in and essentially looking at China and saying, this is not a modern nation because they don't have a Chinese language. And late Qing reformers took that criticism very seriously, and began sort of this process of saying that if we are a modern nation, we have to have a Chinese language, and therefore everything else has to be reframed as something else. So those are sort of some of the ways that I get at looking at the historical constructedness of these categories.
So given that there is so much linguistic diversity in China, what was the process by which Mandarin came to be thought about as the single national language?
So this is one of the parts of this history that kind of surprised me the most. Because before I started research on this book, this was a story that I had both read about and been told a bunch of times. And the story is usually that Chinese reformers decide they need a Chinese language. They get together, they vote, they fight it out, and pick an existing language, dialect, fangyan, whatever you want to call it, and they just elevate it to national language, right? But the presumption behind all of these stories is that the question these reformers were asking was always, which one do we choose, right? But when I was doing my research, I found that a lot of them were asking a much bigger question, which is, how does language represent our nation, right? How do we represent and actualize the soul of our nation? Actually, the very first national language that was founded, and then they tried to promulgate it starting in 1913, was in the spirit of this kind of hybrid, bring together different parts of different fangyan to invent a new language that represented the nation. And eventually that national language was abandoned in 1925, and then Beijing, the language of Beijing, was sort of adopted wholesale as the national language. But this idea that the national language has to be more than just the language of the capital, or just picking one winner and the rest are all losers, right? That idea stuck around, right? Even today, the People's Republic of China, the state, will claim that Putonghua, or what we would call Mandarin, is more than just Beijing language, right? It includes the best of all of China's Fangyan. And whether or not that's true is sort of beside the point, because that's how it's imagined.
So in your book, you introduce two main groups of actors. On the one hand, there are people who wanted to see one single standardized national language. And then on the other hand, there are people who saw regional languages or regional dialects as equally important. So what accounted for these two different positions?
For me, what accounted for these two different positions was the idea that there are two different, essentially, visions of the Chinese nation, right? So some imagines the Chinese nation as sort of an essentialized, homogenous construct, right? That to be Chinese, we have to have these different, like a checklist of things that makes us Chinese, right? And that doesn't sort of discount, like we don't need to necessarily get rid of everything else. They're just not representative of the Chinese nation. And then you have these other voices, this pushback, right? That is saying that actually sort of like my Chinese Fangyan is more Chinese than Mandarin. It has an older, richer history. It is more authentic. And all of these sort of various different ways of saying that the Chinese nation really is this heterogeneous, flexible, diverse thing. And that is how we should imagine it.
Getting to a kind of methodological question, in the book, you're mainly focusing on the reform of spoken language, not so much the reform of the written language. But how, as a historian, did you look at the history of the spoken word by relying mainly on textual records?
Oh, that's a great question. And honestly, this is one of the challenges that I had. And so one of the ways I did this was that I sort of guided my research question based upon what I could find. My book is really a history of the discourse about Fangyan, right? It's about how people are talking about what a Fangyan is, what counts as a Fangyan, and how it relates to collective identity. So that's one of the ways that I dealt with this. The other way I dealt with this was that I did, in particular in the 50s and 60s, I used oral history interviews to try and get at some of this sort of disconnect between rhetoric and practice. And so, for instance, like there is this whole movement during the Great Leap Forward that was like, take a great leap forward towards Mandarin promulgation, and everyone has to speak perfect Mandarin, and that's how you prove that you're truly a socialist builder of new China, right? And I interviewed people, and I was like, what did your classroom actually sound like? And people would be like, well, you know, we spoke local Fangyan in the classroom. Like the teacher didn't necessarily speak perfect Mandarin, right? And so that was one of the ways I could get at that. And then sort of finally, I think the way that I had to get at this was just through, I guess you could sort of read silences into the text that I found, right? So for instance, you know, keeping with this theme of the 1950s, right? If this particular rhetoric had been true to life, then everyone today would speak perfect Mandarin. And if you go to China, that's clearly not the case, right? So reading sort of silences in the record in that way is one way I did that. And so while there is always this added challenge with the work that I'm doing, I do think that I, you know, sort of use the historian's toolkit to try and get at it to the best of my abilities.
So at its core, this book is not just a book about language, but I think more foundationally, it's a book about nationalism. So as a historian, what does a focus on language teach us about what nationalism looks like in a Chinese context?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, that is where I really do see the intervention in this book, is rethinking what we think we know about the Chinese nation. And to me, language is a really good way to get at that, because language is so often thought of as one of the most foundational ways we think about national belonging. I hope to sort of bring three new things to the table in thinking about in rethinking the Chinese nation. First, I want to sort of celebrate, or at least sort of bring to the forefront, all of these voices that have consistently pushed back against the idea that the nation is, or even should be, this homogenous construct, right? Is that there are these other narratives that are really important. But beyond sort of celebrating diversity, the second thing I want to do that's sort of an outgrowth of this is to excavate the processes by which homogenization comes to be presumed. My book is saying that like these forces of homogenization are in conversation with other narratives, other ideas. And so that changes the way that we look at how they grow and evolve. And then to me, sort of the third thing my book does is it asks us to sort of flip the order of causation on its head. Like the teleology here, right, is that you standardize a language, you promulgate it, and then people go from being peasants into citizens, right? Whereas I'm saying that before the process of standardization happens, there are people who are arguing for flexibility and diversity in the name of nationalism, right? And so what that means is that it's not how does standardization create nationalism? It is how does nationalism affect narratives for and against standardization? Right? And so it forces us to rethink just the process by which the nation comes to be imagined in the first place.
Well, Gina, I really enjoyed reading your book, and thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely to chat with you.